Back in your grandfather's day, the family farm was a place where honest folks made an honest living, selling what they grew and raised. Fresh milk from the cow, home-canned vegetables, wild mushrooms from the woods, and meat processed right on the farm. But somewhere along the way, the government decided that these time-honored traditions were too dangerous for regular people. What your grandpa sold at his roadside stand would get you shut down by federal agents today. 1. Raw milk. Remember when your grandfather would set out those glass bottles of fresh milk at the end of his driveway, trusting neighbors to leave their money in the coffee can? Back in the day, selling raw milk straight from the cow was as American as apple pie. Farmers across the country made extra income by bottling up their daily milk production and selling it to neighbors who knew the difference between real milk and the watered-down stuff from the grocery store. Your grandpa probably had regular customers who would drive out to the farm every few days, bringing their own jugs to fill up with that thick, creamy milk that still had the foam on top. But the government decided that raw milk was too dangerous for regular folks to handle. Starting in the 1940s and ramping up through the 1980s, state after state began requiring pasteurization and licensing for all milk sales. Today, selling raw milk without proper permits is illegal in most states, and the penalties are severe. We're talking hefty fines, jail time, and the complete shutdown of your operation. 2. Homemade canned goods. Every farm wife worth her salt had shelves lined with mason jars full of pickles, preserves, and vegetables. And selling these homemade treasures at county fairs and roadside stands was a source of both pride and income. Remember when your grandmother's famous bread and butter pickles were the talk of the county, with recipes passed down through generations and techniques perfected over decades? Home canning was both a survival skill and a source of pride. These women could preserve everything from green beans to peach preserves, and their products were sought after by anyone who knew the difference between store-bought and homemade. Today, selling those same homemade canned goods without FDA approval is a federal crime requiring commercial kitchens, pH testing, processing permits, and nutritional labeling that would bankrupt most small operations. 3. Wild foraged mushrooms. Your grandfather knew every edible mushroom, berry, and wild green that grew on his property, knowledge passed down from his father and grandfather before him. Remember when old Pete would show up at the farmer's market with baskets full of morel mushrooms, wild ramps, and other forest treasures that city folks would pay premium prices for? These old-timers could walk through the woods and come back with a feast, identifying dozens of edible species that most people today wouldn't dare touch. They'd sell their wild harvest alongside their regular farm produce, and customers trusted their expertise because these men had been foraging successfully for decades without poisoning anyone. Today, selling wild foraged mushrooms or herbs without proper testing and certification is illegal in most jurisdictions, with liability concerns and government regulations making a lifetime of woods wisdom worthless in the marketplace. 4. Home-raised meat processed. Back when your grandfather raised a few head of cattle or a pen full of hogs, processing and selling meat was a neighborhood affair. Remember when Farmer Johnson would butcher a steer and sell quarters to families around the county? These farmers knew their animals, fed them well, and processed them cleanly in facilities that might not have looked fancy, but got the job done safely. Customers could see exactly where their meat came from, how the animals were raised, and trust that the farmer who raised them would process them properly. Today, selling home-raised meat processed without USDA inspection is a federal crime requiring expensive certified processing facilities, regular inspections, and mountains of paperwork that add enormous costs to what used to be a direct relationship between farmer and customer. 5. Apple cider. Nothing said autumn like fresh apple cider pressed from the orchard's best fruit, sold in gallon jugs with bits of apple pulp still floating in the amber liquid. Remember when your grandfather would fire up that old cider press every October and neighbors would line up with their own containers to buy the freshest, most flavorful cider you could imagine. The apples went straight from tree to press to jug with no processing or additives, just pure apple juice, the way nature intended. Farm stands across America built their fall business around fresh cider, and customers knew they were getting something special that couldn't be found in any grocery store. But health officials decided that unpasteurized cider was a public health hazard, and today, selling it without proper pasteurization, special labeling, and regular testing is illegal in most states. 6. Home-smoked meats and fish. Your grandfather's smokehouse was a thing of beauty. A small wooden building where hams, bacon, and fresh-caught fish were transformed into delicacies that couldn't be bought at any price. Remember when he'd hang sides of bacon in there for weeks, tending the fire and monitoring the temperature like he was conducting a symphony? The art of smoking meat was passed down through generations, with each family having their own secret techniques and wood preferences. Neighbors would pay good money for properly smoked ham or a mess of smoked trout, knowing they were getting something that took real skill and patience to produce. Today, selling home-smoked meats without proper licensing and inspection is illegal, requiring commercial smokehouses, temperature monitoring, and HACCP plans that would cost more than most small farms make in a year. 7. Fresh eggs from free-range chickens. Every farm had a flock of chickens scratching around the barnyard, and selling fresh eggs was one of the most reliable sources of extra income. Remember when your grandmother would gather eggs twice a day and customers would drive out to the farm specifically for those golden-yolked beauties that made store-bought eggs look pale and tasteless? These chickens lived real lives, eating bugs and grass and kitchen scraps, producing eggs with thick shells and rich orange yolks that stood up tall in the pan. Farm-fresh eggs were prized by anyone who knew the difference, and many farm families built steady customer bases around their egg sales. Today, selling fresh eggs without proper licensing, grading, and packaging is illegal in many jurisdictions, requiring expensive equipment and compliance with regulations designed for industrial egg operations. 8. Homemade cheese and butter. Farm wives took enormous pride in their cheese and butter-making skills, producing dairy products that put anything from the store to shame. Remember when Mrs. Henderson would bring her homemade butter to church socials? These women understood the science of dairy fermentation better than most food scientists, using techniques passed down through generations to create products that were both safe and delicious. Their butter was rich and golden. Their cheese had complex flavors that developed over months of careful aging. Today, selling homemade cheese and butter without proper licensing requires expensive commercial kitchens and regulatory compliance that treats these traditional foods like dangerous chemicals. 9. Wild honey from backyard hives. Your grandfather's beehives produced liquid gold, pure, unfiltered honey that captured the essence of every wildflower within miles of the farm. And he'd harvest honey in late summer, bottling the thick, fragrant honey that would crystallize into creamy perfection over the winter. This honey had character, tasting different depending on what the bees had been visiting, and customers could tell the difference between spring wildflower honey and late-season goldenrod honey. Today's regulations have made selling honey a bureaucratic nightmare, with requirements for licensing, labeling, and testing that treat honey like a manufactured product instead of a natural food that bees have been making for millions of years. 10. Fresh-pressed vegetable oils. When your grandfather grew sunflowers or soybeans, pressing oil was a natural way to add value to his crop, and old-timers would bring their seeds to the local oil press or have their own small pressing operations that produced unrefined, unprocessed oil full of natural flavors and nutrients. Customers knew they were getting something special, oil that would go rancid quickly because it hadn't been stripped of everything that made it nutritious. Today, selling fresh pressed oils without proper licensing and FDA compliance requires expensive equipment and regulatory oversight that treats oil production like it can only be safely done by large corporations. 11. Homemade soap and lye products. Every farm wife knew how to make soap from scratch, using lye and animal fat to create bars that would clean everything from dirty hands to greasy dishes. And remember when your grandmother would make huge batches of soap in the fall after butchering season provided plenty of fat for rendering? This soap was harsh but effective, and many farm families sold their extra bars to neighbors who appreciated having real soap that actually worked. Today, selling homemade soap without proper licensing and compliance with cosmetic regulations treats soap like it's a dangerous chemical instead of a basic necessity that people have been making safely for thousands of years. 12. Fresh ground flour and meal. Your grandfather's grist mill was the heart of the community, grinding corn and wheat into fresh flour and meal that made everything taste better, and farmers would bring their grain to be ground while your grandfather kept a portion as payment for his services. This flour was nothing like the processed stuff from the store. It was coarse and flavorful, with all the nutrients that industrial milling removes, and customers would drive miles for fresh ground cornmeal that made their biscuits taste like their grandmother's recipes were supposed to taste. Today, selling fresh ground flour without proper licensing and inspection requires expensive equipment and compliance measures that most small mills can't afford. 13. Wild game processing and sales. When hunting season arrived, your grandfather's meat processing skills were in high demand from hunters who needed their deer, elk, or wild hogs turned into steaks, roasts, and sausage. And he'd set up his processing operation in the barn with hunters lining up with their harvested game. He knew how to handle wild meat properly, aging it correctly and cutting it to maximize both flavor and yield, and many hunters trusted him more than commercial processors because he took pride in his work. Today, processing and selling wild game without USDA certification requires the same oversight as domestic meat, forcing hunters to use expensive commercial processors despite wild animals often being healthier than factory-farmed livestock. 14. Homemade wine and fruit brandies. Your grandfather's fruit trees produced more than the family could eat fresh, so making wine and brandy was a natural way to preserve the harvest, and he'd ferment grape juice in the root cellar or distill apple brandy that was smoother than anything you could buy. These traditional preservation methods turned surplus fruit into products that could be stored for years and actually improved with age, with many farmers selling their excess wine and spirits to neighbors for holidays and celebrations. Today, making and selling wine or spirits without proper licensing is a federal crime that can result in massive fines and prison time, with the ATF monitoring alcohol production more closely than many agencies monitor actual criminals. 15. Fresh-cut tobacco and smoking blends. Your grandfather's tobacco patch produced leaves that were carefully cured and aged in the barn, creating smoking tobacco that was far superior to the mass-produced cigarettes that were just starting to appear in stores. Remember when he'd harvest those broad tobacco leaves in late summer, hanging them in the barn to cure until they reached that perfect golden brown color that meant they were ready for market? Many farmers would blend their own tobacco with other herbs like mullein or coltsfoot, creating custom smoking mixtures that were prized by pipe smokers and those who rolled their own cigarettes. Today, Selling tobacco without federal licensing and tax stamps is a serious federal crime, with the ATF treating small tobacco farmers like they're running illegal drug operations instead of growing a crop that built entire regions of American agriculture. 16 live poultry and baby chicks. Every spring, farm families would hatch out hundreds of baby chicks, ducklings, and goslings, selling the extras to neighbors who wanted to start their own flocks or add to their existing birds. Remember when your grandfather would fire up that old incubator in the basement, carefully turning eggs and monitoring temperature until the chicks started hatching, filling the house with the sound of peeping babies? These farm-hatched birds were hardy and well adapted to local conditions, unlike the commercial hatchery birds that often arrived stressed and weak from shipping. Today, selling live poultry requires expensive NPIP certification, regular testing for diseases, and compliance with interstate shipping regulations that treat a few backyard chickens like they're dangerous livestock that could spread plague across the country. 17. Fresh churned buttermilk. Real buttermilk, the tangy liquid left over from churning butter, was a prized byproduct that farm wives would sell to neighbors who knew the difference between the real thing and the cultured buttermilk sold in stores today. This buttermilk had a clean, sharp flavor that made the best pancakes and biscuits, and it was naturally rich in beneficial bacteria that aided digestion. Your grandmother probably sold buttermilk along with her fresh butter, and customers would bring their own containers to fill up with this liquid gold. Today, selling fresh buttermilk requires the same dairy licensing and pasteurization requirements as regular milk, eliminating one of the most flavorful and nutritious dairy products that small farms once provided. 18. Home-rendered lard and tallow. When your grandfather butchered hogs or cattle, rendering the fat into lard and tallow was both practical and profitable, creating cooking fats that were prized for their flavor and cooking properties. Remember when your grandmother would render lard in huge pots, creating snowy white fat that made the flakiest pie crusts and crispiest fried chicken you ever tasted. This rendered fat was often sold to neighbors who knew that lard made better pastry than any vegetable shortening, and tallow was valued for soap making and cooking. Today, selling home-rendered lard requires meat processing licenses and inspection that treat fat rendering like it's as dangerous as processing fresh meat. 19. Maple syrup and sugar products. When spring arrived and the sap started running, your grandfather would tap his maple trees and boil down gallons of sap into pure maple syrup that had a rich, complex flavor that made store-bought syrup taste like candy. Remember when he'd set up his evaporator and tend the fire for hours, carefully monitoring the temperature until the sap reached perfect syrup consistency? He'd also make maple sugar and maple cream that were prized by customers who knew the difference between real maple products and the corn syrup imitations sold in stores. Today, selling maple syrup requires food processing licenses, proper labeling, and facility inspections that treat this traditional forest product like it's a manufactured food. 20. Fresh pressed cider vinegar. Your grandfather's apple cider would naturally ferment into vinegar if left long enough, creating a product with complex flavors and natural probiotics that was far superior to the distilled white vinegar sold in stores. This cider vinegar had a rich, fruity taste that enhanced everything from salad dressings to pickling brines, and many customers would specifically seek out farm-made vinegar for its superior flavor and health benefits. Remember when your grandmother would use this vinegar for everything from cleaning to cooking, and neighbors would buy jugs of it for their own kitchens? Today, selling homemade vinegar requires the same licensing and testing as other fermented products, treating this ancient preservation method like it's a dangerous chemical process. These 20 products remind us how much we've lost when government regulation replaced common sense and community trust. What your grandfather sold with pride would land you in legal trouble today. If this opened your eyes to how far we've strayed from our roots, subscribe for more stories about the America we used to know. And check out our next video about the illegal farming methods your great-grandfather used that actually worked better than today's techniques. You won't believe what they've banned now.